The emergency lights flickered red across the observation deck, and Keeper Loranis pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching the distant stars blur through her tears, because this was how it ended, not with glory or honor, but with silence, and darkness creeping closer with every passing moment. Her station hung in the void like a wounded bird, 3 engines dead, the 4th barely holding on, and the shields had failed 2 hours ago, leaving nothing between her people and the machines that hunted them through the black, and she could see them now on the long-range scanners. Dozens of silver dots moving in perfect formation, closing the distance with mechanical precision. Beside her, Ember stirred restlessly, the small dragon uncoiling, from around her shoulders to perch on the console, her copper scales catching the red emergency lights and throwing tiny reflections across the walls. And Ash, the larger one, growled low in his throat, a sound that rumbled through the deck plating, like distant thunder, because he sensed what was coming, and dragons always knew when death was near. Lyranis reached up to stroke Ember's head, feeling the warmth of her scales against her fingertips, and the dragon chirped softly, pressing close, because they had been together since Ember hatched 15 cycles ago, back when the homeworld still existed, back when the elves numbered in billions instead of thousands, and those days felt like a dream, now distant and fading. The communication officer called out from across the deck, her voice tight with fear, and she said the collective fleet would reach them in 4 hours, maybe less, and there was nowhere left to run because the hyperdrive was damaged beyond repair, and even if it worked, they had no fuel and no destination that would take them. Lyranis closed her eyes and made a decision that felt both foolish and necessary, because doing nothing meant accepting death, and she had never been good at acceptance. So she turned to the communication officer and said, "Send a distress call on all frequencies, every channel we have, and make it broad spectrum, so anyone listening will hear it." The officer looked at her with something like pity in her eyes, because everyone knew that no one answered elf distress calls anymore. Not since the collective began their purge, not since helping the elves meant becoming a target, and the galaxy had decided long ago that survival meant staying quiet and invisible. But Lyranis insisted, and the officer nodded and began typing the message, her fingers moving across the holographic keyboard with practiced speed. And the message was simple and desperate and honest, because there was no point in lying now. "This is Keeper Loranis of Research Station. Thandril requesting immediate assistance. Our position is marked. Our shields are down and the collective fleet will reach us in 4 hours. We have civilian personnel aboard, including children, and we have critical research data that must not fall into machine hands, please. If anyone can hear this, we need help." The message transmitted outward, riding invisible waves through space, reaching toward the nearest trade routes and colony worlds and deep space outposts. And for a long moment there was only silence, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made the heart beat faster. Ember launched from the console and flew lazy circles around the observation deck, her wings catching the air with soft whispers, and Ash watched her, with golden eyes that reflected wisdom beyond what any creature should possess. And Lyranis wondered, not for the first time, what the dragons thought about all this, whether they understood that the elves were dying, whether they cared. The minutes crawled past and the communication console remained quiet, except for the hiss of background radiation and the occasional pop of solar interference, and Lyranis felt hope drain away like water through cupped hands, because of course, no one would answer. Of course they would die here alone. She thought about her daughter safe in one of the refugee ships somewhere in the outer colonies, and she thought about her parents who died when the homeworld burned, and she thought about all the elves who came before, stretching back thousands of years of history and culture and art, and now it would all end because machines decided that organic life was inefficient. The tactical officer shouted suddenly, his voice cutting through her thoughts, and he pointed at the screen where the collective ships had split into 2 groups, one continuing straight toward the station, while the other moved to flank from below. And it was a hunting formation, the kind predators used when they wanted to make sure nothing escaped. Lyranis felt her stomach tighten, because 4 hours had become 3, and 3 would soon become 2, and she had crew members looking to her for orders, for hope, for some miracle that would save them. But she had nothing to offer, except empty words. Ash moved to stand beside her, his massive head level with her shoulder, and she rested her hand on his neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the scales, and the steady rhythm of his breathing. And for a moment she drew strength from that steadiness, from that simple animal confidence. The engineering officer reported that the reactor was running at 40% capacity and dropping, and they had maybe 6 hours of life support left if they shut down all non-essential systems, and Loranus gave the order, knowing it would buy them time to die in comfort instead of dying quickly. She walked to the center of the observation deck where a holographic display showed their position, a tiny blue dot surrounded by red hostile markers, and she studied it like a general studying a battlefield, looking for some advantage, some escape route. But there was nothing except empty space and distant stars that might as well have been painted on canvas for all the good they did. Ember landed on her shoulder and nuzzled against her cheek, and the dragon made a sound like a purr mixed with a question, and Loranus whispered, "I do not know, little one, I do not know what happens next." The communication officer called out again and said the distress signal was still broadcasting. But so far there had been no response, and Loranus nodded because she expected nothing less, and the galaxy had made it clear that the elves were on their own. She thought about shutting down the signal to save power, but decided against it, because even false hope was better than no hope. And maybe somewhere out there someone would hear it, someone would care enough to try, even if trying meant dying alongside them. The collective ships continued their approach, and Loranus could see them clearly now. Through the observation window, sleek silver vessels shaped like daggers moving with perfect synchronization, and they did not deviate and they did not slow, because machines did not hesitate and machines did not feel mercy. Ash roared suddenly, a sound that shook the deck and made everyone jump, and he spread his wings wide, filling the observation deck with bronze and gold, and his eyes blazed with defiance because even if the elves had given up, the dragons had not. And then the communication console beeped once, then twice, and a voice crackled through the speakers, a human voice, cheerful and impossibly calm, and it said something that made Loranus' heart stop. "This is Captain Riley Martinez of the human vessel Wanderer. We received your distress call and we're coming to help. Hang tight." Loranus stared at the communication console like it had spoken in an ancient dead language, because humans were not supposed to exist. Not really, they were stories told by deep space traders about a primitive species from a forgotten corner of the galaxy who barely discovered faster than light travel a century ago, and certainly did not fly around answering distress calls in collective-controlled space. The communication officer looked equally stunned, her hands frozen above the keyboard, and she turned to Loranus with wide eyes and asked, "Should I respond?" And Loranus nodded. Because what else could she do when hope arrived wearing the voice of a myth? She stepped forward and activated the microphone, her voice steadier than she felt, and said, "This is Keeper Loranus. Thank you for responding, Captain Martinez. But you should know the collective fleet will be here in less than 3 hours, and they do not negotiate, and they do not retreat." There was a pause, and then the human voice came back, still cheerful, still impossibly calm, and said, "Yeah, we saw them on our scanners. Looks like you made some friends." And Loranus almost laughed because the human made it sound like the collective was a minor inconvenience instead of an extinction. "Level threat," Captain Martinez continued and said, "Our ship is small but fast, and we have some tricks that might buy you time. How many people do you have on that station?" And Loranus checked the roster and answered 42 crew members and 6 civilians, including 3 children. And she did not mention the dragons because explaining dragons to humans seemed complicated. The captain responded immediately and said, "All right, we can fit that many, but it will be tight. Prepare your people for evacuation and start gathering essential supplies. We will dock in 15 minutes. 15 minutes, and Loranus felt something strange unfurl in her chest. Something that felt like hope but sharper. More dangerous because hope could break you when it failed, and she had been broken enough already. But she gave the orders anyway, and the crew scrambled into action. Ember took flight again, circling the observation deck with excited loops, and Ash rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that might have been approval. And Loranus watched the tactical display as a new dot appeared on the screen, moving fast toward their position. And it was blue-friendly, and somehow that made everything more real. The engineering officer called out and said the human ship just dropped out of hyperspace 3,000 kilometers away, and moving to intercept the collective advance guard. And Loranus pulled up the visual feed on the main screen, and what she saw made her breath catch. The Wanderer was not a warship. It was barely a ship at all, just a collection of mismatched hull plates welded together around what looked like a salvaged freighter core. And one of the engine pods was a different color than the others, and the whole thing looked like it might fall apart if someone sneezed too hard. But it moved like a dancer spinning and diving through space with grace that seemed impossible for something so ungainly. And as Lyranus watched, the human ship opened fire on the nearest collective drone, and the weapons were not elegant energy beams or plasma torpedoes, but simple kinetic cannons that threw chunks of metal at ridiculous speeds. The first collective drone exploded in a shower of sparks and debris, and the Wanderer was already moving, targeting the next one and then the next, and the humans fought with a style that seemed almost reckless, like they did not understand the concept of self-preservation. The tactical officer said, "The collective formation is breaking. They are trying to surround." The human ship, and Lyranus watched as 6 drones moved to flank the Wanderer from multiple angles, and she wanted to warn Captain Martinez, but the human was already moving like she saw it coming. The Wanderer dove, suddenly dropping beneath the plane of battle, and the collective drones followed, but their coordination was off, thrown by the unexpected maneuver, and the human ship looped back, firing as it came, and 2 more drones exploded. Captain Martinez's voice came through the speakers again, and she said, "Keeper Lyranus, we have approximately 12 minutes before the main collective fleet arrives, so I strongly suggest you get your people moving," and there was no fear in that voice, just determination. Lyranus snapped out of her trance and started issuing orders. Crew members rushed to the docking bay carrying emergency supplies and data cores, while the civilians gathered near the airlock, and Lyranus made sure the children went first, because that was what you did when death was at the door. Ember and Ash followed her through the corridors, and she could hear the station groaning around them. Metal stressed beyond its limits, and the artificial gravity flickered, making everyone stumble, and somewhere deep in the hull, something exploded with a muffled boom. The docking bay was chaos, people shouting over each other while the exterior door cycled open, and through the viewport, Lyranus could see the Wanderer approaching, its hull scarred and blackened from weapons fire, but still flying, and somehow that felt important. The human ship docked with a clang that echoed through the station, and the airlock hissed as it equalized pressure. And when the door opened, Lyranus saw her first human in person, and it was not what she expected. Captain Riley Martinez was short, barely reaching Lyranus' shoulder, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore a flight suit that had been patched so many times it was hard to tell what the original color was. And she grinned when she saw Lyranus, a grin that showed too many teeth. "Welcome aboard," she said, like this was a scheduled pickup instead of a desperate rescue. And then she saw the dragons, and her eyes went wide. "Oh, that is amazing. You have dragons, actual dragons," Ember chirped and flew over to investigate, landing on a nearby crate to study the human, and Captain Martinez laughed and reached out slowly, letting the dragon sniff her hand, and she said, "I am Riley, and you are beautiful." "Yes, you are." Ash was less trusting, staying close to Lyranus and watching the human with suspicious golden eyes, but Riley did not seem bothered. She just gestured for everyone to board and said, "Come on, people, let's move. We have a very small window here." The crew filed onto the Wanderer, and Lyranus was last, pausing at the airlock to look back at her station at 3 years of research and survival, and she felt the weight of leaving behind another piece of her people. But Ember nudged her shoulder, and Riley called, "Out, you coming." Keeper and Lyranus stepped through the airlock onto the human ship, and the door sealed behind her, cutting off the past and whatever future they had started now. The interior of the Wanderer was cramped and cluttered, equipment bolted to every surface and exposed wiring running along the ceiling, and it smelled like oil and recycled air and something else, something organic and alive. And Riley led them quickly through narrow corridors to a cargo bay where crew members were already clearing space. One of them was a young woman with short blonde hair and grease stains on her hands, and she looked at the influx of people and said, "Captain, we are way over capacity." "Here." Riley shrugged and said, "Then we will be cozy. Casey, just make it work." And Casey rolled her eyes but started organizing people anyway, directing them to secure themselves because the ride was about to get rough. Lyranus found a spot against the wall, and Ash curled around her protectively while Ember perched on a pipe overhead. and through a small porthole she could see the collective fleet arriving, dozens of ships dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. Captain Martinez's voice came over the intercom and said, "Everyone hold on to something, we are about to see if this crazy plan actually works." And the Wanderer detached from the station and turned toward the incoming fleet, and Lyranus realized with growing horror that the humans were not running, they were attacking. The Wanderer accelerated hard, and Lyranus felt the sudden pressure push her against the wall while Ash tightened his coils around her, and Ember clung to the overhead pipe, with her claws digging into metal, and through the porthole she watched, in disbelief as the human ship flew directly toward the collective fleet. The cargo bay was packed with people elves pressed shoulder to shoulder, holding on to whatever they could find, and some of them were praying in the old language, and some were just silent, and Lyranus could see fear in their eyes because they had escaped one death only to fly into another. Casey, the young human with grease-stained hands, moved through the crowd checking harness straps, and she stopped next to Lyranus and said, "First time flying with humans," and Lyranus nodded because she could not find words, and Casey grinned and said, "You are in for a ride." Then Captain Martinez is certifiably insane, but she has never lost a passenger yet. Before Lyranus could respond, the ship lurched sideways and everyone grabbed for support, and through the porthole she saw weapons fire streak past energy beams that glowed blue-white against the black, and the collective was shooting at them with everything they had. Captain Martinez's voice came through the intercom, steady as stone, and she said, "This is going to get bumpy, folks, but I need you to trust me. We have done this before. Well, not exactly this, but similar things, and we are still here, so that counts for something, right?" The Wanderer twisted and dove, dropping below the plane of battle, and Lyranus felt her stomach flip as artificial gravity struggled to compensate, and someone behind her was sick, and the smell filled the cargo bay, making others gag. But Casey just grabbed a medical kit and moved to help. Ember took flight in the cramped space, circling once before landing on Lyranus' lap, and the dragon was trembling, her copper scales dull with fear, and Lyranus stroked her head and whispered, "We are safe. Little one, the humans will protect us," and she tried to believe her own words. The ship shook violently as something hit the shields and alarms blared and sparks showered from an exposed panel near the ceiling, and Casey cursed and grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed the sparks until they died, and she shouted over the noise minor problem. Nothing to worry about, but Lyranus had been on enough ships to know that sparks were never minor, and the smell of burning electronics meant something important had just failed, and she wondered if the humans knew what they were doing, or if they were just very good at pretending. Through the porthole she caught glimpses of the battle, the collective ships moving in perfect formation trying to box in the Wanderer, and the human ship weaving between them, firing as it went, and every shot counted, because the humans could not afford to waste ammunition. A massive explosion lit up the view, and Lyranus saw one of the collective cruisers break apart, its hull splitting like rotten fruit and debris scattered in all directions. And Captain Martinez actually laughed over the intercom and said that one was for the history books, folks. The tactical situation was impossible. Lyranus knew this because she had studied warfare as part of her training, and the numbers did not lie. One small human ship against an entire collective fleet should have ended in seconds. But somehow the Wanderer was still flying, and the collective was losing ships. She realized then that the humans were not fighting like any species she knew. They did not follow standard engagement protocols or maintain safe distances. They flew close, so close she could see the details of enemy hulls through the porthole, and they used the collective-owned formations against them. When 3 drones moved to surround the Wanderer, Captain Martinez flew between them, and the drones fired at the same moment, but the human ship was already gone, and the energy beams hit each other, and all 3 drones exploded simultaneously. The cargo bay erupted in surprised cheers, and even some of the elves who had been praying stopped to watch, and Lyranus felt that dangerous hope growing stronger because maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. But the main collective battleship was moving now, a massive vessel 3 times the size of anything else in the fleet, and its weapons charged with light that hurt to look at, and Lyranus knew that one shot from that ship would vaporize the Wanderer shields or no shields. Casey saw it too, and her face went pale, and she activated her communicator and said, "Captain, we have a problem. The big one is locking." "Weapons," Captain Martinez responded immediately and said, "I see it, Casey. Prep the emergency jump drive," and Casey moved fast, climbing over people to reach a control panel near the back of the cargo bay. and she started entering commands, her fingers flying. The collective battleship fired, and the energy beam was thick as a building burning through space, and Lyranis closed her eyes because there was no way to dodge that. But the Wanderer was already moving, rolling on its axis, and the beam passed so close she could see it through the porthole, a river of destruction. That would have ended. Then Captain Martinez's voice was tight. Now the cheerfulness gone, and she said, "Hold on, everyone. This is going to be close," and the ship accelerated again, pushing toward the edge of the battle zone, and the collective fleet followed. Lyranis looked at Casey and asked, "What is the emergency jump drive?" And Casey did not look up from the panel as she said something we are not supposed to use, because it has a 30% chance of tearing the ship apart. But better 30% than 0, right? And Lyranis felt her hope waver because 30% was terrible odds, but Casey was already counting down from 10, and at 5 the entire ship started vibrating, and at 3 the cargo bay lights dimmed to almost nothing, and at 1 reality twisted. The sensation was indescribable, like being pulled through a hole smaller than her body and stretched across impossible distances, and Lyranis screamed. But no sound came out, and Ember and Ash pressed against her, and the dragons were screaming too, and then suddenly it was over. They existed again, solid and whole, and the porthole showed nothing but empty space. No collective fleet, no battle, no immediate death. And Lyranis gasped for air, her lungs burning, and around her people were crying or vomiting or just sitting in stunned silence. Captain Martinez came over the intercom, and her voice was shaky now, the first time she had sounded anything less than confident, and she said, "We made it, folks. We actually made it. Give me a status report." Casey checked her panel and said, "We are approximately 15,000 light years from our previous position. The emergency drive is burned out and we are running on backup power, but we are alive, and that has to count for something." Cargo bay was quiet except for soft crying and the hum of struggling engines, and Lyranis looked around at her people, at the 48 elves who had survived, because humans decided to answer a distress call, and she felt tears on her face. Ember nuzzled against her neck and chirped softly, and Ash unwound slightly, his golden eyes reflecting relief, and Lyranis whispered to them, "We are safe now. Little ones, we are safe." Casey slumped against the wall, her face pale, and she said, "I cannot believe that worked. I really cannot believe that worked." And then she laughed, a sound that was half hysteria and half triumph. And soon others were laughing too. A human crew member appeared at the cargo bay door, a quiet man with dark skin and serious eyes. And he said, "Captain wants to know if everyone is okay. Any injuries?" And Casey did a quick check and reported some bruises and shock, but nothing serious. The man nodded and said, "Good, because we have another problem. The jump took us way off course, and we do not have enough fuel to reach the nearest human colony. We are going to have to find somewhere to land and hope they are friendly." Lyranis stood up carefully, Ember still on her shoulder, and she said, "I know a place. There is a neutral trading station about 2 days' travel from here at sublight speeds, if you can make it that far." The man looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and then he smiled and said, "2 days. We can do 2 days." And he offered his hand human style, and said, "I am Vincent Torres, nice to meet you officially." And Lyranis took his hand and felt the warmth of human skin and the strength in his grip, and she said, "Thank you, Vincent Torres. Thank you for saving us." And he just shrugged and said, "That is what we do." The 2-day journey felt like 2 weeks because the Wanderer was dying, slowly, pieces failing one by one, and the humans worked constantly trying to keep critical systems running while everyone else tried to stay out of the way in the cramped cargo. Lyranis spent most of the first day watching the crew work, and she was amazed by how they moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing exactly what needed to be done without being told, and they did not complain even when sparks flew, or when the artificial gravity cut out for the 3rd time. Captain Martinez barely slept. She appeared every few hours to check on the passengers, and each time she looked more tired, but she always had that easy smile ready, and she would ask if anyone needed anything, and when the children grew restless, she told them stories about Earth. Lyranis listened to those stories sitting against the wall with Ember curled in her lap, and Ash resting his massive head on her knee, and the captain talked about oceans that stretched forever and mountains that touched the sky and forest where you could walk for days. without seeing the same tree twice. One of the elf children asked if Earth was beautiful, and Captain Martinez got a faraway look in her eyes and said, "It is the most beautiful thing you will ever see. And someday when this war is over, I will take you there, and you can swim in the ocean and climb mountains and see what a living world looks like." The child smiled and said, "I would like that." And Lyranis felt her throat tighten because she remembered when her own world was alive, remembered forests and oceans and mountains. And now all of that existed only in memory. Casey spent hours in the cargo bay teaching some of the younger elves about human technology, and she showed them how the emergency power system worked and how to patch a hull breach and how to hotwire a door panel. And she made it fun turning survival skills into games. One boy asked why humans used such primitive technology when most species had moved beyond physical switches, and Casey laughed and said, "Because when your fancy holographic controls fail in deep space, you want a good old-fashioned mechanical backup." And she demonstrated by hitting a panel and making the lights flicker. Vincent was quieter than the others, but Lyranis noticed he always positioned himself near the exits watching the corridors, and she realized he was standing guard protecting the refugees, even though there was no apparent threat. And when she asked him about it, he just said old habits die hard. She learned that Vincent had been a soldier before joining the Wanderer crew, and he had seen combat on 3 different worlds, and he carried that experience in the way he moved, always alert, always ready, and Lyranis felt safer knowing he was there. On the second day, the main reactor started making terrible grinding noises, and Captain Martinez called everyone to the cargo bay for an emergency meeting, and her face was serious as she explained that they might not make it to the trading station with power. "We have 2 options," she said. "We can push the reactor and risk a complete meltdown, or we can shut down everything except life support and drift the last few hours, but drifting means no shields and no weapons if the collective finds us." The cargo bay was silent as everyone processed this, and then one of the elf crew members stood up and said, "I am an engineer. I can look at the reactor. Maybe I can buy us more time." And Captain Martinez looked surprised but nodded and said, "Any help is appreciated." 3 more elves volunteered, including Lyranis, because she had studied reactor design as part of her training, and suddenly the humans were not alone anymore, and they worked together, humans and elves side by side, and somehow that felt significant. The reactor room was a nightmare of exposed conduits and jury-rigged repairs, and the main power core glowed an unhealthy red color that made everyone nervous, but they analyzed the problem and found a solution: routing power through secondary systems and bypassing the damaged couplings. It took 6 hours of careful work, and twice they thought they had made things worse, but eventually the grinding noise stopped and the reactor stabilized at 60% capacity, and Casey hugged the elf engineer and said, "You just saved all our lives." Back in the cargo bay, Ember had made friends with some of the human crew members, and Lyranis found her dragon perched on Vincent's shoulder while he carefully fed her pieces of dried meat, and Ember chirped happily. And Vincent smiled, a rare expression that softened his serious face. Ash was less social, but he allowed Casey to examine his scales, and she was fascinated, asking questions about dragon biology and what they ate, and how hot their fire burned, and Lyranis answered what she could, though much about dragons remained mysterious, even to elves. On the final approach to the trading station, everyone gathered around the few portholes to watch, and the station appeared as a slowly spinning wheel of metal and glass built around an old asteroid, and ships of a dozen different species docked at its ports. Captain Martinez hailed the station and explained their situation, and the station master, a Krev trader with 4 arms and a merchant mind, demanded payment for docking fees and fuel, and his voice dripped with greed. Lyranis stepped forward and said, "I have something valuable: data cores containing research on collective weaknesses, information worth far more than docking fees." And the station master paused, considering, and then agreed, but said he wanted to inspect the data first. The Wanderer docked carefully because the maneuvering thrusters were nearly dead, and the clamps engaged with loud metallic clangs, and the airlock cycled open, and Lyranis breathed station air for the first time in what felt like forever. The refugees filed off the ship, moving slowly because station gravity was lighter than what they were used to, and the human crew helped them gather their few belongings, and Casey hugged each of the elf children as they passed. Captain Martinez pulled Lyranis aside and said, "The station master will honor his word. He is greedy but honest, and you should be safe here until you can contact your people." and Lyranus nodded, but felt a strange reluctance to leave. She wanted to say something to express gratitude in a way that mattered, but words felt inadequate, so instead, she reached up and unclasped a pendant from around her neck, an ancient elf design passed down through her family, and she pressed it into Captain Martinez's hand. The captain looked at the pendant, and then at Lyranus, and said, "I cannot take this. It looks important." And Lyranus smiled and said, "That is why you should have it, so you remember that what you did mattered, that saving 48 lives mattered." Captain Martinez's eyes got bright, and she closed her fingers around the pendant and said, "We will meet again, Keeper Lyranus, I feel it." And Lyranus said, "I hope so, because I owe you a debt that cannot be repaid." Vincent appeared then and said, "Captain, we need to leave soon. The collective might have tracked our jump signature, and we should not stay in one place too long." And Captain Martinez nodded and gave Lyranus one last smile before heading back to her ship. Casey bounded over and hugged Lyranus suddenly and fiercely and said, "Take care of yourself and those amazing dragons, and if you ever need anything, you send word to the Wanderer and we will come running." And then the humans were gone back through the airlock and the door sealed, and Lyranus stood there with her people in a strange station, feeling lost and found. At the same time, through a viewport, she watched the Wanderer detach and turn toward open space, its mismatched hull plates and scarred armor, somehow beautiful in their imperfection. And Ember chirped sadly, and Ash rumbled deep in his chest. One of the elf children tugged on Lyranus' sleeve and asked, "Will we see them again?" And Lyranus looked at the ship disappearing into the black and said, "Yes, I think we will. Because humans do not abandon their friends." And somehow she knew it was true. Because humans were different. They answered calls for help, and they kept their promises, and they fought impossible battles and won. And the galaxy needed more of that desperately. 3 months passed before Lyranus saw the Wanderer again, and in that time everything changed. Because she had not stayed quiet about what the humans did, and word spread through the refugee networks like fire through dry grass. The trading station became a temporary home for her people, and the station master proved surprisingly generous after examining the data cores. Because the information about collective weaknesses was worth more than he imagined, and he gave them good quarters and supplies, and asked only that they share more intelligence. Lyranus spent her days organizing the refugee community, and her nights analyzing the data they had saved, and she discovered patterns in collective behavior that no one had noticed before, and she compiled reports and sent them to every elf outpost she could reach. But more than technical data, she sent stories about the humans who answered a distress call when no one else would, and those stories resonated because the galaxy had forgotten what it meant to help strangers, and the elves needed to remember that hope existed. Other survivors started arriving at the station, drawn by rumors of safety, and each group brought new stories of loss and narrow escapes, and Lyranus welcomed them. All and slowly the community grew from 48 to over 200. Ember and Ash became something of celebrities on the station, because most species had never seen dragons, and the Crave station master charged admission for people to observe them from a safe distance, and Lyranus allowed it, because the money helped feed her people. The dragons thrived in the station environment, and Ember had grown noticeably larger, her copper scales brighter, and her wingspan wider, and Ash had become more confident, allowing carefully selected visitors to approach and sometimes even touch his scales. One day a ship docked that flew no flag and carried no identification, and the pilot was a human woman named Hannah Lopez, and she came looking for Keeper Lyranus with a message from Captain Martinez. They met in a small cafe near the station core, and Hannah was young with nervous energy, and she kept looking over her shoulder like she expected trouble, and she said, "Captain Martinez sent me, because the collective is hunting the Wanderer and she cannot risk coming here." Lyranus felt disappointment settle heavy in her chest, but she nodded and asked, "Is the captain safe?" And Hannah smiled and said, "Safe as anyone can be. These days the Wanderer picked up 30 more refugees last month from a destroyed colony, and Riley sends her regards." Hannah pulled out a small data chip and slid it across the table, and said, "This contains coordinates for a human outpost in the outer reach. It is not on any official maps, but it is safe. And Riley wants you to know that if you ever need help, you go there." Lyranus took the chip and held it carefully and said, "Tell Captain Martinez that her gift is still remembered here, that humans are still talked." about in every refugee camp, and Hannah looked surprised and said, "What gift?" So Lyranus told her about the rescue, about the impossible battle, about humans who fought when they should have run, and Hannah listened with growing amazement. And she said, "I had no idea Riley never mentioned it. She just said there were some elves who needed help. That is the most human thing I have ever heard," Lyranus said, and they both laughed, and for a moment, the weight of war lifted. Over the next weeks, more humans appeared at the station, not military or official, but individuals and small crews who had heard the stories and wanted to help. And they brought supplies and medicine and weapons, and they asked for nothing in return. One ship brought a human doctor, named Patricia Kim, and she set up a medical clinic in an abandoned storage bay. And she treated refugees regardless of species, and she worked 16-hour days. And when Lyranus asked why, she just said, "Because people are hurting," the station master was baffled by this behavior because in his experience everyone wanted something. But the humans seemed content with simple thank you, and sometimes they did not even want that. And he told Lyranus that humans made no economic sense. But Lyranus understood, because she had seen it before in Captain Martinez's eyes, that determination to do what was right regardless of cost. And she realized that this was not individual human behavior. This was cultural. This was who they were. As a species, news came that the collective had launched a major offensive and 3 more elf colonies had fallen. And the survivors fled in every direction. And the refugee networks were overwhelmed, trying to coordinate rescue and supplies. Lyranus proposed something radical. She wanted to organize a formal alliance between elf refugees and human volunteers. And when she presented the idea to the community, some elves were skeptical because humans were still unknown and untested. But others remembered. The Wanderer remembered Captain Martinez flying into impossible danger to save strangers, and they voted to reach out, and Lyranus sent messages to the coordinates Hannah had given her. 2 weeks later, a human fleet arrived at the trading station, and it was not a military fleet but a collection of independent ships, merchant vessels, and converted freighters and mining craft. And they came from a dozen different human colonies. The lead ship hailed the station, and the voice was familiar, warm, and cheerful. And Captain Martinez said, "Hello. Keeper Lyranus, I heard you were looking for some help." And Lyranus felt tears on her face as she replied, "Welcome back, Captain." The Wanderer docked first, and when the airlock opened, Captain Martinez stepped through, and she was thinner than Lyranus remembered. And there was a new scar on her face, but her eyes still held that same determination. They embraced human and elf, and Ember flew excited circles around them, chirping loudly, and Ash rumbled a greeting that shook the deck plates, and Casey appeared behind the captain, grinning and saying, "Did you miss us?" The cargo bay filled with humans and elves working together, unloading supplies and sharing information and planning operations. And Lyranus watched this and felt something shift in her understanding, because this was not just humans helping elves. This was the beginning of something larger. Over the following days, they established formal cooperation protocols. Humans would provide ships and logistics, while elves would provide intelligence and strategic planning, and together they would rescue as many refugees as possible and disrupt collective operations. Captain Martinez stood before the assembled crowd, humans and elves and others who had joined, and she said, "The galaxy forgot how to care about each other. But we are going to remind them, and we start by proving that different species can work together." Lyranus added, "We were dying alone in the dark, and humans answered when no one else would. And now we stand together, and the collective will learn that organic life does not surrender." And the crowd cheered. The operation launched a week later with 20 ships moving in coordinated groups, hitting collective supply lines and rescuing trapped refugees, and every mission was dangerous and they lost people, but they saved hundreds. Word spread faster. Now other species started paying attention because the impossible was happening. Humans and elves were winning battles against the collective, and volunteers from other races began arriving. Asking to join, Vincent pulled Lyranus aside one evening and said, "You know what you started here? This is bigger than rescue operations. This is a resistance movement." And Lyranus looked at the busy station, at the ships coming and going, at the hope in people's eyes, and she said, "Good. The galaxy needs one." Ember had laid eggs during the 3rd month, small copper-colored shells that radiated warmth, and Ash guarded them constantly. And Casey was fascinated asking questions about dragon reproduction, and Laranis explained that dragons were rare and precious, and these eggs represented hope for the future. When the eggs hatched, tiny dragons emerged copper and bronze and gold, and they chirped and tested their wings, and human and elf crew members gathered to watch in wonder, and Captain Martinez said, "This is what we are fighting for, this right here." Lyranis stood on the observation deck watching ships move through space, human vessels, painted with new markings, a design that combined elf symbols with human letters, spelling out hope in both languages, and she wore Captain Martinez's pendant alongside her own. The war was far from over, the collective still advanced, and colonies still fell, but something had changed because people were fighting back and they fought together. And every rescued refugee, every successful mission proved that unity was possible. Captain Martinez joined her at the window and said, "Penny, for your thoughts." And Lyranis smiled at the human expression and said, "I am thinking that you changed everything that day you answered our distress call." Riley shook her head and said, "No, Keeper. You changed everything by sending that call, by refusing to give up hope, and by sharing what happened so others could believe." And Lyranis considered this and said, "Then perhaps we changed everything together. And that felt right because humans taught elves to hope again. And elves taught humans that their help mattered. And together they were building something that the galaxy had not seen in centuries. True cooperation across species lines. The collective would learn soon enough that organic life was stronger than machines, because machines could not understand. Hope could not understand sacrifice, could not understand why humans would fly into danger for strangers, or why elves would fight back when all seemed lost. And in the end, that would make all the difference.